friends. Welcome to episode 38 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect those of my district. When incorporating research, I always cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. My apologies for talking so quickly during my last episode, in case you missed it, Season 1. Michigan has been experiencing a heat wave, and I had to turn off the air conditioning while I was recording. Needless to say, there were members of my family who were not enthusiastic about me recording my podcast while they were all at home. Before we dive into today's topic, nErDcamp Michigan, I would like to follow up on some ISTE resources I found this week. First, I would like to thank Margaret from Michigan. Margaret listened to my ISTE 19 episode and included it in her comments in the section of Joyce Valenza's School Library Journal's blog, The Neverending Search, posted on July 1st, titled ISTE Librarians Takeaways, Crowdsourced Updated. I'll attach a link in the show notes. Joyce Valenza's blog post was a compilation of reflections and resources shared out by many school librarians who attended ISTE. I was honored to have my link to my ISTE 19 episode, as well as the links in my episode show notes included in this blog post. The good news kept on coming because very shortly thereafter, I heard from Linda in Missouri. Linda asked if she could add my ISTE 19 episode to the ISTE 19 resource page of the ISTE Librarians Network website. I have included a link in the show notes. It was incredibly validating to find that listeners wanted to make my episode available to others looking for resources shared at this year's ISTE convention. I recommend you take a look at both of these resources as they were created by and for school librarians. There is such a wealth of information. I'm glad I have some time during the summer to really explore and plan for the upcoming school year. The next two resources I think you'll find extremely useful, and they come from one of the authors who attended nErDcamp this year. I was incredibly fortunate to have a chance to interview Karina Jan Glazer. Hey everybody, this is Amy and I'm talking from nErDcamp, and I was able to find Karina Jan Glazer, and I would love to have her share with us why her podcast is a resource that I think we can all enjoy and learn from.
Great. Hi, this is Karina Jan Glazer. I'm a children's book author, and I'm also a contributing editor at BookRiot. I write their newsletters, children's book newsletters that come out twice a week. And I'm also a co-host with Matthew Winner of KidLit These Days, which is a podcast that comes out every 2 weeks on Thursdays.
I got to tell you, I really like listening to your podcast because it really speaks to the collections that we have to grow and enrich and become more inclusive. And the resources that you give us and especially they're all itemized in your show list, have been really terrific for me to use as a reference when I'm trying to create a more diverse and inclusive collection.
Yeah, so our episodes, we usually start planning them months ahead of time. We start thinking about what's showing up in the news, looking at some trends that are happening around the world, and then try to relate that back to children's books. So sometimes certain events happen, or, we're celebrating Pride that month, and we'll sort of take a look at what books have come out recently, or sort of things that we think that should be in every library, school library, public library, classroom, and then we book talk those. So Matthew and I have a great time talking about that and planning these episodes, and we have about 9 episodes right now, and we've covered many topics. The border wall in America, we've talked about the hijab, we've talked about Pride, and we've got a lot more coming up too.
I'm so excited. So you are planning to continue recording into the fall, and some of this seems to be organic. So as things spring up in the news, it gives us a reason to pull from our resources and bring this relevance to our students.
Yeah, so Some of the topics, we've been thinking about for a while, and then some things come up pretty suddenly, and we start thinking about books that could be helpful to talk about that topic, or things that we think that students would really gravitate towards, trying to process something that might have happened in the world news. So some of it is organic, and some of it is stuff that we've been thinking about for a while.
I really enjoy reading your the email newsletter that I receive. It can get a little expensive because you do such a good job of book talking. Would you give us any information about how you come up with those inspirations? Because it really does help me in creating my collection.
Right. So the children's book newsletter comes out twice a week, and one day on Tuesdays is sort of the day that most new books are released, so I talk about new releases on that day. And then on Sundays, I usually do themed book lists, and those ideas are very random. Sometimes I'll be reading a bunch of books and I'll see a common theme in them, and then I'll just sort of jot those books down and sort of build the list that way, and just sort of think like, okay, I just read this book about foster care, I just read another book about foster care, and then thinking about other books that relate to that topic and sort of build it that way. And I keep a notebook with me all the time, so whenever I'm thinking about a topic, I'll sort of think about other books that might feed into that. For example, a couple months ago, I started getting a lot of books about the Apollo mission, the moon landing. So I was wondering about that and realizing it was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo landing. So then I started thinking about books about space and the moon landing, and sort of building a book list that had both current books that reflected sort of the newer information about, celebrating the 50th anniversary, as well as other classic children's books about the moon, and sort of building the list that way.
Well, I got to say, before I let you go, most of my listeners will know you not as a podcaster, not as a BookRiot newsletter contributor, but they know you as a New York Times award-winning bestseller author. And I'd love to give you a chance to tell our listeners about the good news regarding your series.
Right, so The Vanderbeekers of 141st Street was my first book. It came out in 2017, and it will be followed up it will be a 5-book series. So the second book is already out, The Vanderbeekers in the Hidden Garden. The third book, The Vanderbeekers to the Rescue, is coming out this September, and there will be 2 more. And it's been a really amazing journey. I love writing them, and it's been really fun to connect with the readers and to hear about which Vanderbeeker they relate to, and it's been really wonderful.
Well, I'd like to highly recommend also your website, because especially for those of us who live outside of the New York City area, it's full of a lot of resources. And I think that for our fans and of your books, it was also really great that you keep all of that information readily accessible for those of us who want to be able to tell our students about you and your writing process.
Well, thank you. The website is really fun to keep up to date, and I put all the archives of my newsletters on there. All the book lists are on there. So if you're looking for a specific topic, you might want to browse through the book recommendations portion of the website and sort of see if there's something that might be good for your library collection. And I also put a lot of photos of my pets on there, which is really great.
Would you mind sharing us your social media tags so that anybody who isn't already following you can make sure, because you do have very cute pets, but if you'd like to give us your social media contacts, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. So my website is KarinaGlaser.com, KarinaGlaser.com. I'm on Instagram at Karina is Reading and Writing, and on Twitter at Karina Yan Glaser.
Outstanding. I can't thank you enough for giving me some time. I know it's been busy.
This is really fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So if it wasn't already obvious, I'm an enormous fan of Karina Yan Glaser, and I also appreciate any time somebody creates a podcast and a newsletter, which helps me do my job. I recommend that you take a listen to Karina and Matthew's podcast, KidLit These Days, anywhere you download your podcast, and also subscribe to BookRiot's The Kids Are All Right newsletter. I'll include links in the show notes to both of these resources. I do want to collectively thank the lovely folks in Pennsylvania's Library Association Summit, which was held recently. This podcast was shared out, and I very much appreciate any time new listeners find this podcast. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions, either on Facebook or on Twitter, or at my email, schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. I had two reasons for deciding to post an episode on nErDcamp. The first being that this is the original nErDcamp, and unlike the 16,000 educators who attended ISTE 2 weeks ago, only 1,800 educators attend nErDcamp each year. This being year number 7, its successes have been evident by the repeat attendees who swear they never miss a nErDcamp. This devotion is no better exemplified than the mother who attended both days, all while wearing her newborn in a sling. The second reason is because I'm aware increasingly more and more educators around the country are initiating their own nErDcamps in their states modeled after the nErDcamp I was so fortunate to attend. I hope this episode provides you with some additional insight and resources in the show note to facilitate hosting your own nErDcamp. The history of nErDcamp is provided in a little book we all received when we entered the school on day 1, published by Penguin Young Readers Group. What is nErDcamp is a helpful 20-page booklet. Started in 2013 with a vision and 180 attendees, nErDcamp has grown into 1,800 attendees representing more than 40 states. What is remarkable is that this entire undertaking is made possible without charging attendees a registration fee or paying speaker fees. nErDcamp happens because the founder, Colby Sharp, along with Elena Sharp and their team of dedicated volunteers, and the support of Western School District, whose middle and high school host all of the nErDcamp activities, come together. I noticed especially the dutiful tech team comprised of students who made the rounds and checked on each speaker to make sure that their tech issues were resolved before the session started. What an undertaking. This was my very first nErDcamp, and it was unforgettable as my first ISTE conference was held just 2 weeks before. I've spent a great deal of my childhood crisscrossing the state of Michigan, and I've lived in Michigan for more than 25 years. And I have never had occasion to visit Parma, Michigan, home of the original nErDcamp. If you would like an idea of location, use the map we in Michigan so often use for ready reference. Raise your left hand, palm facing away from you. That is the lower peninsula of Michigan. With your right hand, point to the middle of your wrist and go up 1 inch. That is where Parma, Michigan is located. To appreciate just how remarkable it is that all of these giants in children's literature converged on this particular Michigan town to inspire and share their talents, you should know that the last census of Parma had a population of 769. That was in 2010. There are beautiful rolling hills, ancient trees. You pass lovely homes with manicured lawns and flower boxes tucked away from the main road. But there are very few businesses, and most of the restaurants and hotels were in neighboring town of Jackson, about 6 miles away. And yet, just by walking through the parking lot of the high school, you get an appreciation of everyone who is there, noticing the license plates on everybody's cars. I saw Illinois and Indiana, Iowa and Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Missouri, New Jersey, North Carolina, New York, Ohio, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, to name a few. I also learned of an international contingent, which made a point of coming to nErDcamp this year, specifically from Singapore, Thailand, Oman, and the Netherlands. On the Sunday before nErDcamp began, Colby Sharp, creator of nErDcamp, posted an extremely helpful walkthrough video on YouTube. I've attached a link in the show notes. For rookies such as myself, this was really fantastic because we had a chance to take a virtual tour of the main areas of the school that would be used for nErDcamp without having to navigate through a crowd of 1,800 educators moving from place to place. Day 1 began with an author panel on the topic of feminism for all, feminism in schools, KidLit, and the world, with Patricia Valdez, Laura Chauvin, Supriya Keller, Alicia D. Williams, and Pernille Rip. And the discussion was moderated by Jen Vincent. The opening ceremony included anecdotes by Min Lee, C.C. Bell, a passionate appeal from Lori Halse Anderson, and a rousing speech by Donalyn Miller, which set the tone for the entire conference. After a brief break for lunch, we attended 3 one-hour sessions of our choosing and returned to the gym for a closing speech by Jason Reynolds. You wouldn't know that 1,800 educators were in attendance because everyone sat in stunned silence, captivated by the performance. Day 2 incorporated an nErDcamp format. While attendees filed into the gym, a queue of participants formed behind the microphone. Each one took turns introducing themselves and announcing their topic, which was then handed to someone who typed in the entry into an idea board. It was a grid on a Google Doc, which would then be shared out. There were 2 sessions offered in the morning, 25 rooms of varying capacity. We were then invited to select the sessions which best suited our needs. We had an hour for lunch and met again in the gym to repeat the process. Another queue formed, another grid was created, and we selected 2 afternoon sessions. I'll attach a link to the webpage in the show notes. You can see all of the offerings under Day 1 and Day 2, and many of the nErDcamp sessions on Day 2 have links where the notes were compiled and shared out. So what happened in between sessions and during the breaks over these 2 days? The school's cafeteria and commons area was buzzing with excitement. There were concessions for sale, a coffee and pastry vendor, a bookshop stocked with copies of the books authored and illustrated by all the featured authors and illustrators attending nErDcamp. I'll admit, I wouldn't recognize many of my favorite authors and illustrators, but watch groups of attendees cluster around, and in the center you'll find some award-winning New York Times best-selling authors and illustrators just talking and signing books and posters. Out of one of the doors of the cafeteria, there were 5 food trucks with lots of offerings. What I obviously didn't attend was nErDcampJR. This took place in the evening of our second day, and I've attached a link to nErDcampJR, the website, for more information in our show notes. So tips for those of you planning to attend next summer. Set 3 alarms and get up early, because this conference sold out in less than 50 minutes. I say sold, but in keeping with the spirit of nErDcamp, there is no registration fee. There are no speaking fees. The authors and illustrators who participate are gratis. Registration starts at 5:30 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, on February 1st, which happened to be a school day. There was a wait list, and I can't say how many were lucky enough to eventually get registered. While the registration fee is free, you'll no doubt incur some expense traveling to and from the conference, as well as some housing for several days, if necessary. Teaming up with fellow educators will always help spread out those costs, and it doesn't hurt to appeal to your administration for reimbursement of these expenses. One very nice surprise for Michigan educators, our sketchies, our continuing education credits, which usually cost $10 to file with the state registrar, was included in our registration fee, which was free. So that was nice. If you are driving, consider packing a cooler and keeping your lunch in the car. You won't have to carry your lunch all morning, nor will you have to wait in the line for food at the food trucks. I did overhear some teachers talking, and the trick to being in the front of the line is to leave the previous session a few minutes early. That isn't my style. I'm one of the people who's still left talking with others after the session has ended, and most of the folks have filed out of the room. Many educators brought their own copies of books to be signed by the authors and illustrators who attended, or chose to buy copies from the bookstore, which was set up inside the school. If you're collecting signatures, it is important to you to remember that you will be standing in a few lines. I had flashbacks to Disney World when the Disney characters would make their appearances for photos, and you'd be standing and waiting for your turn. So you do need to be selective. But the best solution I saw, which I really would like to replicate next year, is to buy a canvas bag, and it has the library card imprint on the outside. I've included a link in the show notes so you can see one. And when you walk around the conference, you have the bag signed by the authors and illustrators, and they can include a place for the date. I especially like this because transporting books from all of my libraries isn't feasible. Plus, my students don't necessarily appreciate or understand the relevance of the signature. And this might have happened to you in your own library, but during checkout, a student will open up a book only to discover a scribble on the inside cover, and they protest, "Mrs. Herman, I swear I didn't write in this book. It was like that already." When I explain to them that that's the author's signature, their reaction is sort of mixed, and they're a little confused. I would recommend you come dressed for the part. You have found your people. If I had to guess, more than 80% of the attendees wore book-inspired attire. There were book-themed shirts and skirts and bags. Classroom teachers and school librarians alike sported their book-loving attire. And if you don't have a t-shirt, never fear, the bookstore came prepared with racks of t-shirts with at least 10 different designs in every size and color. Be prepared to take notes. And if the Wi-Fi is being a little challenging because there are so many devices on the guest login, going old school with a pen and a notepad is sometimes the way to go, especially because if you're sitting in the bleachers of the high school gym, it's not always a great place to whip out a laptop and start taking notes. I don't like taking pictures of presentation slides with my phone, but I discovered that that became necessary. Something I did notice, which was in stark contrast to the ISTE presentations I had seen 2 weeks before, was that never once, either on day 1 or day 2, did presenters offer a QR code or a shortened URL for the presentation. Now, understandably, many of the nErDcamp presentations are spontaneous and organic, but I had become rather spoiled attending EdTech conferences, and I had the expectations that sessions would have links to the slides. Now, Day 2's grid did offer a link to a Google Doc in which attendees could jot down their notes and links. And what needed to happen in those sessions was that somebody who knew a little something about the nErDcamp format would generally speak up and mention that everybody in the room could contribute and access these notes that they shared during the session. What I really appreciated was that having attended ISTE 2 weeks ago and then coming to nErDcamp, these two formats were so strikingly different on scale and concept, and yet their objectives were the same, and that was to share and to collaborate and to network. And at the end of both of these conferences, attendees left energized and motivated and ready to delve into a wealth of resources and ideas which will hopefully launch us into the next school year. To help anyone listening to this podcast episode launch your own nErDcamp in your own hometown, I'd now like to share out 2 resources: a great article written by the expert Colby Sharp himself, and an interview I had with a school librarian from North Carolina who will be hosting her second nErDcamp in just a few weeks. Currently, there are nErDcamps scattered across the United States, in Georgia, Kansas, Long Island, Maine, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Washington. The mission statement is always the same. Every reader has value and a voice in the community. Posted in School Library Journal on June 5th, 2019, Colby Sharp wrote, "How to Start a nErDcamp." I'll include a link in the show notes. I really found his advice to be so reassuring to anyone who would like to host a nErDcamp for the first time. His first piece of advice: start small and let it grow. To expect your nErDcamp to be an overnight success just isn't reasonable. I also especially like Colby's second piece of advice. Quote, "Make it your own. You shouldn't try to recreate nErDcamp Michigan," end quote. And here's a piece of advice that I really feel is key to remember. Colby said, quote, "If you need to raise a bunch of money, you are probably doing it wrong. It is not about the stuff or the big name speakers. nErDcamp is about educators helping kids fall in love with reading. A nErDcamp with 25 passionate people who are there to learn is going to be much more effective than a nErDcamp with 1,000 attendees who want cool swag. end quote. And if I can interject at this point, herein lies a major difference between a nErDcamp experience and attending ISTE. As I mentioned in that episode, I was acutely aware of educators in Philly 2 weeks ago with 10 or more bags from the expo, and they were scouring tables of each of the vendors for free pens and stickers and candy. Finally, the last piece of advice, which I found to be most reassuring, is, quote, be cool with things going wrong. nErDcamps are not hosted by professional event planners, end quote. I love that. Anytime we take risks, we need permission to know it won't ever be perfect. I will quote Tracy Chun, whose mantra, brave before perfect, is a guiding principle for me and this podcast. Be sure to check out the link in the show notes to read this article in full. And now I'd like to share with you a great interview I had with someone I met in the elevator when I was checking in at our hotel. Her name is Amy, and she and her sister are school librarians in North Carolina. And I asked if I could interview them because Amy had shared with me that the two of them had hosted a nErDcamp in North Carolina, and their second one would be coming up in a few weeks.
Well, you're a long way from home. When I met you, you said you drove over 10 hours to get here. Tell me, when did you start coming to nErDcamp in Michigan?
Okay, so I came to nErDcamp, I think it was back in like 2015 was my first time here. And I came with my sister, Sarah, and she had come to the second nErDcamp. It was the third year of nErDcamp when I came. And I was very introverted at the time. I know that's a little bit shocking, but I was very introverted. I didn't know anyone. When I first got here, I was like, wow, this is big. There's a lot of people. I don't know. I felt very uncomfortable. But this was before I started presenting and doing things professionally myself. So I came, and the first time that I was here, I went to a session. It was on day 2. With Donald Miller and Pernell Rip. And we were talking about students being leveled. And unfortunately, we have reading counts in my district, which what we do with that is we assign each kid a level, and they have to get books on their level from the library. Though I am trying to push for us to get rid of that because it's harmful to our students.
Well, and forgive me, but that program costs money, right? Money that I'm sure you have other ways you could be spending it.
Yes, and I'm hoping that we will get rid of it soon because the kids really don't like it. They're not.
So tell me, I'm curious because you made the jump. How many nErDcamps did you go to before you said, I can do this, I can bring a nErDcamp to my neighborhood school?
Okay, so this year is our second year of nErDcamp North Carolina. So we have had a couple of years of experience with coming to this camp. The way we actually became a team was by Josh Funk, who is an author that comes here, because he had met Sarah and I here at nErDcamp, and he had met our friend Brian Smith at Reading Summits and other PDs. Brian works with Scholastic. He's one of the Scholastic bloggers. And then we have also Travis Crowder, who is our other team member. And he had met Josh through NCTE. And so he knew all of us. We had all said something to him about having a nErDcamp in North Carolina. Oh, we really need that there. We had all said something to Josh. And so what Josh did was he put us on in a Facebook group on Messenger, and he said, all of you have talked to me about having a nErDcamp in North Carolina. And so he was like, why don't y'all get together and plan it? And he was like, I will help you from the author end. So Josh actually came last year to our first camp. He flew down to North Carolina, and he helped us set up. He helped us communicate with authors. He really helped us get the first one going.
Can you tell me what are some ideas you have moving forward, having been to the nErDcamp here in Parma, Michigan? What are some things you'd like to do in your nErDcamp in North Carolina?
Okay, so it was important to me when we decided to have nErDcamp to just focus on the EdCamp style. So we do not have a day like we had today, which is where we had people that are professionals in their areas that presented. What we do is we have a completely ed style in our nErDcamp, because to me, that's the magic part of nErDcamp. And if you haven't been to a nErDcamp before and you come to one of them and it's that style, you feel like you have a voice. And that's really important to people that attend, because oftentimes at conferences, you are sitting there and listen to this person that you may or may not connect with, and you may or may not feel like you're getting what you need from the session. And with that nErDcamp style, you can just get up and leave and nobody's going to be offended.
This is very true. Can you tell me, for any listeners who are looking to do something similar, what would be your advice to somebody who is hoping to create a nErDcamp in their state, in their school community?
Okay, my advice first is to start off small. Do not think that you're going to come to Parma and have 1,500 people and that's going to be your camp. That is not going to be your camp. Our first camp was 60 people. And it was nice and it was intimate. And the authors appreciated it because they actually had time to talk to each other and spend time together, as opposed to like talking to all the educators and stuff. They did talk to all the educators, and also the books thing. There is a pressure that you have books from the authors to sell. And you want to make sure that you hook up with the independent bookstore for that. And you want to try to get things through word of mouth. Don't be disappointed if you have a small number at first. Like when we showed up, first camp, it was raining. A lot of people signed up and didn't come because the weather was bad. So we had less numbers than we wanted. And I had to get over that initial disappointment because I was like, we should have more people than this. And I was scared that the magic wouldn't happen, but it did. We still had the conversations. We still had people that communicated, that felt like they had a voice. You know, teachers presented during the second part of the day. Once they figured out what it was about, your attendees might not understand that part. So you may need to, give them the morning. Ask your authors to fill in the morning sessions, or your nErDcamp team take a morning session. So that way the attendees can see. Because what we did that at the beginning because the attendees weren't understanding how it worked. And so once they went to those sessions, then the afternoon planning session, we had a bunch of educators who wanted to talk about stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm just really glad that you and I bumped into each other because, having a conversation in the elevator, you never know who you're going to meet. But I just find it's really inspirational that you go to something like nErDcamp in Michigan and then drive back to North Carolina with these ideas and hopes to move forward. So you plan on having another nErDcamp next year?
Yes, we're hoping to continue it and it just grow from where it is now.
I really appreciate you talking to me today. Thank you so much.
I would like to extend a very special thank you to everyone whose resources made recording this episode so meaningful, and to the listeners whose feedback helps plan the direction of every episode I do. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions, either on Facebook, Twitter, or email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. And if you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a thank you sticker. I am inviting all of my listeners to contribute to Season 2's opening episode, Advice for a First-Year Librarian. What would you say to a first-year librarian? What do you wish you knew when you started? What do you think a first-year librarian would like to know that would help them? And I've included a link in the show notes to the podcast webpage where you can leave a SpeakPipe message to be included in Episode 1 of Season 2. If you would prefer, you can direct message or email me your advice, and I'll read it aloud in the episode. My goal is to post this episode on August 24th. I appreciate that many schools' calendars resume at the end of July. Just as our school years came to an end across about 6 or 7 weeks in May and June, so too does the beginning of our school years, at least in the United States. I will be sure to send out a few Twitter and Facebook reminders because I would love your feedback, and I know that our first-year librarians would especially appreciate your suggestions and your perspective. I'd like to thank you for listening today. If you know another school librarian who might enjoy or benefit from listening to this podcast, please let them know. Posting feedback on Twitter and leaving a comment on Apple Podcasts is always appreciated, as it's a great way to help others find this program. As I mentioned before, I'll be taking a break between Season 1 and Season 2. Thank you for joining me and being a part of this listening community. I hope you'll have a restful summer, and I look forward to August 24th when School Librarians will launch Season 2. I hope you will tune in.